Hello, wanderer of untold stories. Close your eyes and picture a valley wrapped in morning mist. The roofs of a tiny medieval town rise like sleeping beasts beneath the pale dawn. A castle sits on the hill above it, grim and watchful, its towers etched in grey against the sky. And in the narrow streets below, the scent of fresh bread drifts through the cold air, warm and sweet, the only comfort in a world ruled by fear. Our story begins with Thomas, the village baker. He is no hero, no warrior, just a man whose hands know the rhythm of kneading dough better than the hilt of a sword. Each morning before the first bell of the church rings, his small oven is already glowing, his face lit by the red breath of the fire. The people of the village trust his bread more than the promises of their lords. But even a man who lives for simple work cannot escape the silent weight of the castle. From its walls, the lord of the valley dictates the grain tax, the tithes, the laws. His knights patrol the roads, and his steward keeps records of every loaf that leaves the bakery for the castle kitchens. For the villagers, the castle is not a dream of protection, it is a shadow that stretches into every home. On one frostbitten morning, when the wind gnawed at the shutters and the sky promised snow, Thomas carried a wicker basket of bread up the steep road to the castle. He had done it 100 times before, yet that morning was different. As he passed beneath the iron gate, a gust of wind caught the hood of a young maid who hurried across the courtyard, almost tearing it from her hair. She turned to catch it, and in that simple movement, her eyes met his. Her name was Alara. She worked in the lower kitchens, unseen by nobles, her voice quiet even among the other servants. To Thomas she was a stranger, and yet, in that heartbeat when their gazes locked, it felt as though he had known her all his life. Something unspoken flickered there. Curiosity, recognition, perhaps even longing, before she lowered her eyes and vanished into the shadowed corridor. That evening, as the snow began to fall, Thomas found himself shaping the next day's dough more gently than usual. The memory of her eyes lingered like the warmth of the oven's glow, though he scolded himself for it. A baker dreaming of a castle maid? Foolish. Dangerous. The laws of the land were not written for such thoughts. Days passed. Winter thickened its hold. The river froze at its edges, and the castle's towers were capped with white. Each dawn Thomas delivered his bread, and sometimes, only sometimes, he caught a glimpse of Alara in the busy kitchens. A word was never exchanged, even a greeting could have been misread. Yet small signs began to appear. The basket left on the step after delivery would sometimes have a sprig of thyme tucked beneath the cloth, or the crust of a loaf would seem to bear the trace of a fingertip that lingered too long. One morning, when the snow lay deep enough to swallow footprints, Thomas discovered a narrow blue ribbon tied around the handle of the breadbasket. No message. No name. Only that ribbon, vivid as a flame against the winter gray. He stood in the empty street holding it, his breath misting in the icy air, and he knew that some invisible line had been crossed. In those times, such a gesture was perilous. The servants belonged to the castle as much as the stones of its walls. A village baker was free only in name. To be seen exchanging tokens could be punished as theft of honor, or worse, as defiance of the Lord's order. And yet Thomas carried the ribbon home and hid it beneath the straw of his bed, as if it were a treasure. The snowstorm that followed kept the roads blocked for 3 days. When at last the path reopened and Thomas returned to the castle, he saw her again, at a distance, carrying water from the well, her face half hidden by the hood of her cloak. She never looked his way, but as he turned to leave, something made him glance back. For a moment, he thought he saw the faintest smile on her lips. That night, while the village slept under a white sky of stars, Thomas stood in the doorway of his bakery, the blue ribbon in his hand. He wondered whether a man's life could change because of so small a thing. Could a simple baker dare to reach beyond the boundary drawn by birth and law? Or was he already lost the moment he looked into her eyes? Far above, in the castle's highest chamber, the steward counted the household stores. His eyes were sharp, his memory sharper. He had noticed a servant who sometimes lingered near the outer gate when the baker came to deliver bread. He had noticed, too, that the maid's ribbon was gone. The snow that blanketed the town in silence also muffled footsteps, and at night the steward walked the lower corridors with a lantern, his shadow flickering along the stone walls. In his mind, the smallest irregularities were like sparks in dry straw, a missing ribbon, a glance too long, a basket delivered later than usual. He had lived long enough under the Lord's command to know that disobedience always began as something small. Elara, unaware that eyes were already turning toward her, moved through the kitchens like a whisper of smoke. She scrubbed pewter plates until her fingers ached, stoked the embers in the hearth, carried water for the cook. The other maids teased her for her silence, but they never guessed that in the hush of each evening, when she folded her coarse woolen dress and let her hair fall loose, she thought of a man whose hands were rough from kneading bread. For Thomas, each day of work grew heavier with expectation. He found himself baking not only for the village but for an unseen listener, as though the crackle of the crust or the softness of the crumb might carry a message across the distance between them. Every loaf he shaped felt like a question pressed into dough. Will she notice? Will she understand? Late one afternoon, as the wind tore through the streets, Thomas lingered by the bakery door, watching the pale light die over the castle walls. A boy from the castle kitchen came running down the hill, his breath rising in clouds. He carried no basket, only a folded scrap of parchment. Thomas's heart struck against his ribs as he took it, but it was merely an order for an extra delivery. The Lord's guests would require more bread by dawn. The boy left as swiftly as he had come, but in the fold of the paper Thomas found something that was not ink, a tiny pressed violet, brittle from the winter air. That night he could not sleep. He laid the violet on the table beside the blue ribbon, staring at them as if they were relics of some forgotten faith. A baker's life was meant to be measured in sacks of flour and hours of labor, not in ribbons and flowers. Yet here he was, wondering if the world could bend to the will of two hearts. At the same hour, Elara climbed the narrow stairs that led to her small sleeping quarters above the scullery. A sliver of moonlight cut across her floor, and in it she saw the mark of her own choices. She had not spoken to Thomas, had not even touched his hand, and yet the quiet exchange of tokens felt like a vow. The fear that stirred in her chest was not of punishment, but of what her own heart had already decided. A week later, when the frost cracked under the weight of cartwheels and the sky softened to a gray thaw, Thomas found an excuse to linger near the outer wall after his delivery. The guards were half asleep in their watch house, their breath thick with ale. The courtyard smelled of wet stone and horse sweat. Elara passed with a basket of linens in her arms. She did not look at him. But as she crossed the narrow archway, something slipped from the basket, a small scrap of cloth. She didn't stop to retrieve it. Thomas bent to pick it up and realized it was the hem of an old apron, carefully torn, as if meant to be taken. In the weave of the cloth was stitched a single thread of blue. The moment was fleeting, but in that fleetingness lay a spark of defiance. For the steward, whose habit was to notice everything, the pattern was becoming too clear to ignore. A servant girl with her thoughts elsewhere, a baker with deliveries timed too conveniently. He began to watch the gates with sharper eyes, biding his time, certain that all he needed was one moment of proof. That proof would come sooner than either Thomas or Elara could guess. The thaw did not last. By the time the first shoots of grass dared to pierce the soil, the river swelled with meltwater, and the roads turned to mud that clung to cartwheels and boots alike. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke from the village chimneys. The castle gates dripped with rain, and the old stones seemed to weep. Thomas, trudging uphill with the breadbasket slung over his shoulder, felt the weight of more than loaves. Each step toward the castle was a step toward risk, yet the thought of not going, of surrendering to fear, gnawed at him like hunger. The blue ribbon he now kept sewn into the lining of his sleeve, a secret warmth against his skin. That morning, when he reached the kitchen door, the usual clatter of pots and the hum of servants' chatter felt oddly hushed. The cook, a broad woman with arms like kneaded dough, muttered to herself while chopping onions. A young scullion hurried past Thomas without even glancing up. The atmosphere was taut, as though the air itself carried a warning. Elara appeared from the inner corridor, her face pale beneath the soft brown wisps of hair that had slipped from her headscarf. She reached for the basket of bread but did not meet Thomas's eyes. Instead, she brushed her fingers lightly against the rim of the basket, so briefly that no one else could have noticed, and turned away. That night, as rain tapped against the shutters of his bakery, Thomas unpicked the thread in his sleeve. The ribbon slipped into his palm, frayed now from days of wear. He thought of her hand grazing the basket, and wondered whether the silence between them was growing heavier or more intimate. In the castle, Elara sat by the dying embers in the servants' hall. The other maids were already asleep, curled like kittens beneath rough wool blankets. She stared into the fading glow, thinking of the blue ribbon she had not seen since the winter. She could still feel the warmth of Thomas's presence whenever their paths crossed, fleeting, wordless, but alive. Yet now there was a weight in her chest, a sense that the quiet game they played was coming to an end. The steward, meanwhile, had his own thoughts by candlelight. In his small chamber overlooking the inner courtyard, he sorted through ledgers and reports, yet his mind lingered on the maid with the lowered gaze and the baker whose deliveries seemed to grow longer in pause. He had served the Lord for decades, long enough to know that human hearts often rebel before their hands do. He needed only a single slip to bring the matter forward. That slip came on a misty morning when the castle held a market for passing merchants. The outer courtyard swarmed with villagers and traders. The guards were distracted by the commotion. Thomas, delivering his loaves as usual, waited near the stable arch for the kitchen boy to collect them. Elara crossed the yard with a bundle of linens. As she passed by, the crowd pressed in, and for a heartbeat they stood close enough to hear each other's breath. Thomas murmured, low, quick, almost lost in the noise, a single question. Tomorrow. By the oak. Elara did not answer aloud. Her fingers tightened briefly on the bundle, and then she moved on. The steward, standing in the shadow of a stairwell above, saw nothing more than a servant brushing past a baker. But in the way her shoulders stiffened, in the way the baker's gaze lingered a fraction longer than custom allowed, the steward's suspicions hardened into near certainty. He turned away without a word, knowing that patience often traps more surely than haste. Night fell thick and damp, and the village slept to the lullaby of distant rain. Thomas lay awake on his narrow cot, staring at the low beams above his head. The memory of her nearness in the courtyard felt both like a promise and a curse. The risk was no longer a distant threat, it had become a shadow that followed him into his dreams. High in the castle's servant quarters, Elara sat by the small window that overlooked the dark slope where the ancient oak stood, its branches black against the pale mist. She had given no answer to his question, yet her heart had already decided. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. The night they had both imagined arrived like a held breath. A thin crescent moon slid between the clouds, spilling silver across the muddy road that wound from the village up toward the castle. The oak stood near the bend where the hill began to rise, an ancient sentinel, its branches bare but sprawling like the ribs of a great beast. Beneath it, the damp earth smelled of moss and rain-soaked roots. Thomas waited there long before midnight. The ribbon was knotted once more inside his sleeve, a talisman against the pounding in his chest. Every sound in the night, the far-off bark of a dog, the soft splash of water dripping from the oak's limbs, felt magnified, as though the world itself were listening. At last he heard the faint crunch of steps on the softened earth. A hooded figure moved down the slope, cautious but steady, her lantern wrapped in a fold of her cloak to hide its glow. When she stepped into the moonlight, Thomas saw her face, pale, tense, yet unafraid. For a moment neither spoke. The damp wind stirred the oak branches above them. A few droplets fell like cold tears onto the ground between them. "I shouldn't be here," she said softly, her voice carrying the tremor of truth. "And yet you came," Thomas answered. He kept his voice low, as if even the tree might betray them. "I had to see you. To know it isn't only in my thoughts." Elara lowered the hood. A few strands of hair slipped free, gleaming in the moonlight. "I thought I could forget. That if I stayed silent, it would fade. But it hasn't." Her words were not loud, yet each fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the night. He reached into his sleeve and drew out the frayed blue ribbon, holding it between them. "I kept it," he said. "Every day I told myself I would return it. But I couldn't. A faint smile touched her lips, so fleeting it was almost a shadow. You kept it safe, she whispered. Then perhaps, we both are already past the point of return. For a few heartbeats they stood facing one another beneath the oak's vast limbs, two figures adrift in the great silence between worlds. No grand declarations, no pledges, only the quiet recognition that a line had been crossed. A twig snapped behind them. Both turned sharply, hearts hammering. But it was only the wind shifting branches. The sound faded, leaving behind the heavy hush that follows a near disaster. They looked at each other then, and for the first time Thomas reached for her hand. Her fingers trembled as they met his, but she did not pull away. In the dark above, clouds passed over the moon, casting the hill into deeper shadow. They parted with no promise of when they might meet again. Elara returned up the slope toward the dim castle lights. Thomas remained beneath the oak a long while after, feeling as if the earth itself had shifted beneath his feet. Unseen by them both, a figure lingered farther down the road, where the shadow of a cart concealed him. The steward had followed, silently, without a lantern. He had seen enough to confirm what he had suspected. There was indeed something between the baker and the maid. He watched them part, then turned back toward the castle, his face unreadable in the dark. The following morning dawned damp and gray. The village stirred to its usual rhythm, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the creak of wagons, the cry of geese near the river. But Thomas moved as if in another season altogether. His loaves that day were shaped with a calm steadiness, yet his thoughts kept circling back to the touch of her hand beneath the oak, and to the shadow he had half imagined at the edge of the road. In the castle, Elara returned to her duties as though nothing had changed. She scrubbed copper pots until they shone, poured water for the cook, mended torn linens. Yet when she lifted her eyes toward the narrow window above the scullery, she felt the air in the room tighten, as if invisible eyes were measuring her every movement. The steward said nothing that day. Sometimes silence is more dangerous than accusation. The castle had always felt cold to Elara, but in the days after the meeting beneath the oak, its halls seemed to watch her. The stone corridors that once merely echoed footsteps now seemed to carry whispers that she could not quite catch. The other servants laughed and gossiped as before, but she noticed how their eyes sometimes lingered on her a heartbeat too long, as though they sensed something unspoken. The steward moved like a shadow through these same corridors. He never raised his voice, never questioned her outright. Instead, he observed a glance at the breadbasket as it arrived each morning, a pause when he passed her at the well, a slight narrowing of his eyes when he noticed that she no longer wore the ribbon in her hair. He was a man who believed that patience was sharper than a blade, a man who preferred his prey to walk willingly into the snare. In the village, spring finally broke the back of winter. The air smelled of thawing earth and the first shy buds of wild flowers. For Thomas, the change in season brought no relief. The memory of that night under the oak burned brighter than the new sunlight, but so too did the sense of danger. He had not seen the steward at the edge of the road, but he had felt something, a prickling between his shoulders, the feeling of being watched. One evening, as the sun bled gold behind the hills, Thomas stood by the bakery door, watching the last of the villagers hurry home. The river shimmered in the distance like a blade. He told himself he would stay away from the oak, would not risk another meeting. But as darkness crept across the rooftops, his resolve thinned. He thought of her face in the moonlight, and the way her hand had trembled in his. Inside the castle walls, Elara sat by the hearth after the other maids had gone to their cots. She mended a torn sleeve, her fingers moving by habit while her thoughts wandered. The blue thread she used was nearly the same color as the ribbon she had given away. When the steward's shadow crossed the threshold of the hall, she did not look up, but her heart stumbled in its rhythm. He said nothing, merely passed by, yet she felt the weight of his presence long after he was gone. The first real crack in their fragile secret came with an accident. A visiting merchant, delayed by flooded roads, arrived late in the evening demanding food and a place to sleep. The castle kitchen sprang into a flurry of activity, calling for more bread than had been prepared. A boy was sent running to the village to fetch fresh loaves. Thomas, startled from his work by the urgent knock on his door, handed over what he had ready, then promised to bring the rest himself. It was near midnight when he arrived at the castle gate, his cart half covered by a worn tarpaulin against the drizzle. The guards grumbled at being disturbed but let him through. The courtyard was mostly dark, only a few torches sputtering near the stables. As he unloaded the bread, he saw her, Alara, stepping out of the kitchen with a lantern, her hair loose from its scarf, hastily tied. Their eyes met in the wavering glow. For a moment, it was as if the whole world had narrowed to that single point of light between them. She opened her mouth, as though to speak, but then the kitchen door slammed behind her and a harsh voice barked her name. The steward emerged from the shadows, his expression unreadable. Thomas lowered his gaze and tightened his grip on the breadbasket. He sensed rather than saw the steward's eyes shift between them. That brief, unguarded glance they had shared might as well have been a confession. Alara turned and vanished inside, her lantern's glow swallowed by the dark. The steward said nothing to Thomas, but his silence was colder than any accusation. Thomas finished his delivery quickly and left, the rattle of the cart wheels on the cobblestones sounding unnaturally loud in the night. The rain that began to fall as he descended the hill felt like a warning. The rain did not stop for 3 days. It fell in thin, needling sheets that blurred the lines of the castle walls and turned the village streets into shallow streams. Beneath the unbroken gray sky, even the birds grew quiet. For Alara, those days felt like a reprieve and a threat at once, a lull in which nothing happened, yet everything seemed to draw closer. On the 4th morning the steward made his first move. He summoned the head cook under the pretext of discussing the dwindling stores of grain. In truth, his questions circled like a hawk above its prey, not about bread or flour, but about the deliveries. "Has the baker ever lingered?" he asked. The cook, surprised, wiped her hands on her apron. "Only as much as needed to count the loaves. A steady man, that one." "Why?" The steward gave no answer. He simply nodded and left, but the seed of curiosity was planted. That evening, Alara carried a bucket of water to the washroom when she felt the weight of eyes on her back. She turned to see the steward at the far end of the corridor, hands clasped behind him. He did not speak. He only watched her, as if waiting for her to betray herself by a flicker of expression. She lowered her gaze and moved on, the water sloshing against the wooden rim in her shaking grip. In the village, Thomas was no less unsettled. He sensed a shift in the air, a stiffness among the guards at the gate, the way the kitchen boy avoided lingering to talk when collecting bread. One night, unable to sleep, Thomas stood in the bakery doorway, watching the distant glimmer of the castle's watchfires. He thought of the oak tree, the damp soil beneath their feet, the brush of her hand in his. He wondered if that single meeting had already sealed both their fates. The first true sign that danger had stepped out of the shadows came with the festival of St. Roderick, a time when the Lord traditionally invited the village elders to the castle for a day of feasting and prayers. Thomas, like many craftsmen, was ordered to provide more bread than usual. On the morning of the festival, as he carried the heavy basket to the castle gate, a guard he did not know stopped him with a curt gesture. "Inspection," the man said. Never before had his bread been searched. The guard prodded the loaves with a gloved hand, found nothing amiss, and waved him on. Yet the message was clear, the circle was tightening. Inside the castle, the great hall rang with the clang of goblets and the drone of prayers. Servants scurried like ants beneath the high tables. Alara worked among them, her face a mask of composure. But when she caught sight of Thomas at the far end of the hall, delivering the bread, her breath caught. She forced herself to look away quickly, knowing that a single glance could betray them amid so many watching eyes. The steward stood near the Lord's table, silent, observing. His gaze swept the hall not like a man admiring a feast but like a hunter tracking the faintest trail. When Thomas turned to leave after his delivery, the steward's eyes followed him until the doors closed behind. Night fell with the echoes of the festival still lingering in the air. In the servants' quarters, Alara sat apart from the others, who were drowsy from the day's labors. Her hands were still, her thoughts restless. She wondered whether Thomas had felt the same sharp sense of being watched, as if the very stones of the castle had grown eyes. In the bakery, Thomas laid out the remaining bread for the next morning, his fingers tracing the crust absent-mindedly. He told himself again that he must stay away from the oak, from any place where the steward's suspicions could be fed by a single careless meeting. But as the night deepened and the rain slackened into mist, he felt the old pull, not of recklessness, but of something stronger, the need to know that she was still there, still unbroken by the silence closing in around them. Above, in his narrow chamber, the steward sat at a small table by candlelight, writing a brief note on coarse parchment. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, as if each letter were a nail driven into a coffin. When he was done, he sealed it with the Lord's emblem and set it aside to be delivered at dawn. The snare was no longer merely imagined. It had begun to take shape. The morning after the festival broke clear and cold. A faint mist clung to the river, and the castle bells rang late, as if weary from the long night of feasting. The village stirred slowly, but in the bakery Thomas was already at work, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, the scent of yeast and warm crust rising in the air. Yet his hands moved without thought. His mind lingered on the image of the steward's sharp eyes in the great hall. By mid-morning, a horseman from the castle arrived, his cloak still damp with the river's mist. He brought no bread order, only a sealed message for the village elder. Thomas watched from the doorway as the rider dismounted, handed over the letter, and rode off without a word. Such silent deliveries rarely bore good news. The elder read the note aloud to a few gathered townsfolk, his brow furrowed. The Lord had ordered an inquiry into the conduct of all who supplied the castle. No accusation yet, only a warning that discipline had grown lax and must be restored. To most villagers it sounded like a simple tightening of rules. But to Thomas, it rang like the distant toll of a funeral bell. That evening, as the sky dimmed to ash, he lingered near the oak at the bend of the hill, though he had promised himself he would not. The wind rattled the bare branches. The ground beneath was still damp from the week's rain. He waited until the last trace of daylight faded, but Alara did not come. At last he turned back toward the village, his steps heavy, the silence of the road pressing on him like a weight. In the castle, Alara had wanted to go. She had even managed to slip away as far as the outer courtyard. But the steward's voice stopped her there, calm and low. "You seem restless these days, girl. Perhaps the kitchens are not keeping you busy enough." She lowered her head and murmured a dutiful reply, but she felt his eyes on her long after she had retreated inside. She spent the rest of the night near the hearth, mending linens with fingers that pricked themselves more often than the needle found its mark. 2 days later, the steward acted again, this time openly. He summoned Alara to the small chamber beside the pantry. The door closed behind her with a soft thud that felt far louder than it was. "You've served here 3 years," he began, not looking up from the ledger before him. "A steady record. No complaints." Alara stood with her hands clasped, silent. He dipped his quill into ink, then said casually, "I wonder, does the baker ever speak to you when he brings bread?" Her pulse quickened, but she kept her voice even. "No, Master Steward. Only as much as his duty requires." The steward's eyes rose to meet hers. They were not angry, only coldly curious, like a man peering at a crack in a wall. "Good," he said at last. "The Lord values order. I trust you do as well." He turned back to his ledger, dismissing her without another word. Alara left the room with her head bowed, but inside she felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted. The steward suspected something, of that she was now sure. The question was not if he would act again, but when. That night she slipped a scrap of parchment into the basket of bread returned to the village. No words, only the small pressed violet he had once found before. A sign, not of comfort but of warning. When Thomas found it at dawn, his heart clenched. The violet, fragile and dry, felt like the last whisper of spring caught in the grasp of approaching winter. He tucked it carefully into his palm and told himself that whatever came next, he could no longer wait for chance to decide their fate. At the castle, the steward's preparations moved quietly forward. He spoke to no one of his suspicions, not even the lord. But he arranged for the guards at the gate to be more attentive, for the kitchen boy to report delays in bread delivery, for the maids to be rotated in their duties so that no one person lingered too long near the outer walls. The snare was tightening, invisible but certain, and both Thomas and Alara could feel it in the air, like the gathering of storm clouds beyond the hills. The storm that had brooded over the hills for days finally broke at dusk. The sky churned with gray, the wind carrying a sharp edge, and rain came down in long, slanting sheets. The villagers shuttered their windows and lit candles early, but Thomas stayed at his workbench long after the bread had been baked. The scent of wet earth drifted in through the cracks, mixing with the warm smell of the oven. He had no customers that evening, no excuse to be awake except the restless beat of his heart. Near midnight, a knock came at the bakery's side door, soft, urgent. Thomas wiped his flour-stained hands on his apron and opened it a crack. A boy stood there, soaked to the skin, his breath coming in clouds. "She said you'd know what it means," the boy whispered, and held out a small scrap of cloth. Then he ran off into the storm before Thomas could speak. Thomas unfolded the damp square. It was part of a maid's kerchief, torn roughly along one edge. A thin streak of blood marked one corner. He stood there in the doorway for a long moment, listening to the rain and the faint creak of the shutters. Then he shut the door and began to gather a few things: a cloak, a lantern, a short knife that had not been sharpened in years. At the castle, Alara had spent the evening moving quietly between the kitchen and the laundry room. The steward had grown more watchful. She felt his presence even when he wasn't in the room. Tonight he had ordered her to help with the night meal for the guards, then had dismissed her earlier than usual, with a smile that chilled her more than his sharpest words ever had. She had slipped the torn kerchief to the kitchen boy as he left for the village, hoping Thomas would understand danger and no time for words. Now she sat alone in the narrow servants' dormitory, listening to the rain tapping on the small window. From somewhere in the keep came the muffled sound of raised voices, the steward's among them. The other maids slept heavily, exhausted from the day's work, but Alara remained upright on her straw mattress, her heart pounding in the dark. The rain gave Thomas cover. By the time he reached the castle's outer wall, the lantern he carried had gone out, leaving him a shadow among shadows. He knew the path to the kitchen gate by heart, from years of delivering bread. But tonight there were more guards than usual. He could hear their boots sloshing in the mud as they made their rounds. He waited in the lee of a crumbling wall until one of the guards passed by, then crept forward. The kitchen door was bolted from within. He could only hope that Alara had found a way to leave it unlatched. Inside, Alara finally rose, wrapping her cloak around her shoulders. The voices in the keep had died down. A distant rumble of thunder covered the sound of the door hinges as she slipped into the corridor. She moved like a shadow, carrying nothing but the memory of Thomas's face and the will to reach the outer gate. In the yard, Thomas pressed his back against the wet stone and waited. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, but he barely noticed. His eyes stayed fixed on the door. When it opened at last, it was only by a finger's width, but in the pale spill of lamplight he saw her face. For an instant, everything, the storm, the danger, the walls of stone, fell away. Then the sound of a shout from somewhere above brought it all back. "Alara!" The voice was distant but sharp, cutting through the rain. She glanced back over her shoulder, then pushed the door open wider. Thomas moved to her side, and for the briefest heartbeat they stood together beneath the weight of the storm. Then came the heavy tramp of boots on wet stone, guards moving fast. Alara caught Thomas's wrist. "This way," she whispered, and pulled him inside. The corridor beyond smelled of damp wood and tallow smoke. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, while behind them the shout came again, closer this time. The castle, which had always been a distant, silent fortress to Thomas, now felt alive, a labyrinth of narrow halls and hidden eyes, each corner threatening to reveal them. The rain outside lashed the walls, the wind rattled the shutters, and within those walls two hearts moved together against the tightening snare. The shouts grew nearer, bouncing off the cold stone walls. Alara pulled Thomas into a narrow servants' passage that twisted behind the kitchens and led toward the lower storage vaults. The air there was damp and smelled of old grain. A single torch guttered on the wall, its light barely reaching the floor. They pressed themselves into the darkness just as two guards ran past at the far end of the corridor. Thomas could feel Alara's pulse hammering through the grip of her hand on his wrist. For a moment neither of them dared to breathe. When the sound of boots faded, she tugged him onward. "I know a way," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the steady drip of water from the ceiling. "I've seen the stable boys slip through it to reach the river bank. But we must be quick." They moved down a stairwell so narrow Thomas's shoulders brushed the damp stone. The passage opened into a half-flooded cellar lined with barrels. The water here was ankle-deep and icy. Each step sent small ripples across its surface. Somewhere above, thunder boomed and a door slammed. As they waded through the water, Thomas caught sight of a faint glow near the far wall, a crack in the stone no wider than a handspan. Behind it he could hear the muted rush of the river. A hidden drainage channel, forgotten by the steward. Alara knelt by the gap and began to work at the stones with her fingers, loosening the crumbling mortar. The effort scraped her knuckles raw. Thomas crouched beside her and pushed with the strength of a baker's arms. The stone shifted with a grinding sigh. A sudden clang of metal from the stairwell froze them both. A voice barked an order, "Too close now." The last stone fell away and a gush of river water spilled in, cold and black. Without waiting, Thomas lifted Alara through the opening first, then wriggled in after her. The passage was little more than a rough tunnel carved by the old current, barely high enough to crawl. Behind them came the echo of boots splashing into the cellar. The narrow channel twisted and dipped, carrying them down toward the river. The current tugged at their clothes, urging them onward. At one point the tunnel narrowed so much Thomas had to exhale to squeeze through, the river water lapping at his chin. He reached back to pull Alara forward, feeling her trembling fingers find his hand. At last the tunnel widened and opened beneath a low arch on the outer side of the castle wall. Rain still fell in silver sheets, and the river ran high, but the open air felt like a promise. They staggered up onto the bank, soaked and shivering, and crouched beneath the roots of an old willow tree. The village lay somewhere beyond the bend, its lights hidden by the curtain of rain. Thomas looked at Alara, her face pale in the moonless night. "We can't go back to the village," he said. "They'll search there first." Alara nodded. "There's an abandoned mill upstream," she whispered. "I passed it once as a child. If we can reach it before dawn." A distant horn sounded from the castle walls, one long, mournful note, followed by another. The alarm had been raised. They exchanged a single glance. No words, only the shared understanding that the night was no longer their ally but their only shield. Then, still holding hands, they slipped into the thicket that bordered the river and began to move along the darkened bank, the sound of the river covering their retreat. The rain eased by dawn, but the river still roared at their side as if warning them not to slow. Thomas and Alara moved upstream through a world that seemed drained of color, gray water, black branches, the pale first light caught in the mist. Their clothes clung cold and heavy to their skin, and each step through the sodden grass felt harder than the last. By mid-morning they reached a stretch where the river curved sharply and the forest pressed close to the water's edge. Here the abandoned mill stood, its wheel broken and half submerged. Moss crept up the leaning timbers, and ivy had claimed the stones. Yet the mill still offered a roof and walls, and when they pushed open the sagging door the musty air inside felt like a kind of refuge. Alara sank onto a wooden beam that had once supported the floor and buried her face in her hands. For the first time since the night before, she let herself tremble. Thomas knelt beside her. "We have a few hours before they reach this far," he said quietly. "You should rest while you can." She shook her head. "They won't stop. The steward will tell the Lord whatever story he needs to. We'll be named traitors, or worse." Thomas hesitated, then said, "We can go farther north. There are trading roads that lead out of the Lord's reach. We'd only need enough time to cross the ridge." Alara lifted her gaze to him. "And if they catch us on the road? The Lord's men patrol there. They won't ask questions." The silence stretched between them, filled with the soft drip of water from the mill's cracked roof. "I won't let them take you," Thomas said at last. His voice held no bravado, only the weight of a promise. Before Alara could reply, they heard the distant baying of hounds. Faint, muffled by the wet woods, but unmistakable. The search had already spread from the castle. Thomas rose to his feet. We can't stay long. We'll wait until nightfall, then move. If we keep to the ridge paths, the dogs will lose the scent in the rocks. Alara nodded, though her fingers tightened on the edge of the beam. She had lived her whole life within sight of the castle walls. The world beyond the ridge was unknown to her, a place of travelers' tales and unmarked roads. As daylight faded, the forest grew still again, as if holding its breath. In the distance they heard the horn once more, short, sharp calls this time, signaling the searchers' movement along the river. When darkness returned, they left the mill and climbed into the woods. The trees grew dense on the slope, their wet branches brushing their faces. The moon broke through the clouds now and then, silvering the rocks and roots. Once, as they crossed a narrow ravine, a loose stone skittered down into the depths below, clattering like a bell in the stillness. They froze, listening, but the night answered with only the sigh of wind in the pines. Near midnight they reached a ridge where the forest opened onto a rocky ledge. From there they could see the castle far behind them, a faint shape against the sky, its torches flickering like scattered embers. Alara stood beside Thomas, staring back at the distant walls. For a moment her face was caught in the moonlight, weary, determined, and touched with something like grief. That was my whole world, she said softly. And now it hunts us. Thomas looked at her, then at the dark expanse of hills ahead. The world is bigger than those walls, he said. We'll find a place that proves it. From the valley below came the echo of another horn. This one sounded nearer. Thomas took Alara's hand. We keep moving, he said, until the dawn finds us somewhere they don't expect. They turned away from the sight of the castle and started down the far side of the ridge, two small figures disappearing into the vast, waiting dark. The night deepened as they descended the ridge, the forest rising on either side like walls of blackened spears. The moon was hidden again by ragged clouds, and they had only the sound of the river far below to guide their steps. Every twig that cracked beneath their boots sounded to them as loud as the horn calls behind them. By the time they reached a narrow hollow between two slopes, the wind had shifted. It carried with it a faint chorus of baying hounds, closer now, threading through the forest like an unbroken line of pursuit. Thomas slowed his pace, scanning the ground by the dim light that seeped through the clouds. There, he whispered, pointing to a thin deer trail winding up the opposite slope. If we take that, it'll lead us toward the high rocks. The dogs will struggle there. Alara nodded, though her breathing came shallow and fast. The climb was steep, the earth damp and slick, and more than once she slipped and would have fallen if not for Thomas's steadying grip. The climb slowed them, but as they rose higher the sounds from the valley grew fainter, muffled by the stone ridges. Just before dawn, they reached a plateau where the trees thinned and the ground turned to bare rock. They paused at the edge of a sheer cliff. From here they could see the river winding like a silver thread through the dark forest below. The castle's torches were little more than faint sparks now, but in the valleys on the far side of the river they saw other lights, search parties moving with lanterns. They've spread beyond the village, Alara murmured. Thomas studied the distant glow, his jaw tight. The steward won't stop. Not until he has you back in the castle, or me in chains. A gust of cold wind swept across the plateau, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant rain. Thomas turned to Alara. We need to keep going until we reach the mountain pass. There are old hunters' cabins there. If we can find one, we'll have shelter for a day or two. Alara looked at him, at the tired lines in his face, at the damp hair clinging to his brow, and felt the sharp pull of two fears at once, the danger behind them, and the unknown ahead. She said nothing, only nodded. As dawn began to gray the eastern sky, they found a narrow cave half hidden by a tumble of boulders. Inside it was dry and smelled of earth. They crouched there in the shadows, listening for the hounds. At last, as the first light crept across the forest canopy, the baying faded, swallowed by distance. Elara leaned back against the cave wall, exhaustion settling over her like a heavy cloak. Her eyes closed for a moment, but then opened again as she said softly, "I never thought I would see the sky from beyond the castle's walls. And now I wonder if I'll live to see another dawn." Thomas reached out, brushing a loose strand of wet hair from her cheek. "You will," he said. "We both will. We've come too far to turn back." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it a faint, distant sound, not the baying of hounds this time, but the sharp blast of a horn. One short call, then another. A signal. Thomas's eyes met Elara's in the half-light of the cave. "They're not far behind," he said quietly. He moved closer to the entrance, and crouched low, scanning the slope below for any sign of movement. Far down the mountain, where the morning mist still lingered, a flicker of light moved through the trees, then another, and another. Torches. Elara's fingers tightened around the edge of her cloak. "They'll find the deer trail we took," she whispered. "It won't take them long." Thomas's voice was steady, but there was no softness in it now. "Then we'll have to move before they reach the ridge. We can't let them corner us between the cliffs and the forest." The first rays of sunlight struck the upper peaks, painting them with a pale gold that did nothing to warm the cold air. Thomas turned to Elara. "We move as soon as the light is strong enough to see the path," he said. "No more rest." Elara nodded, pulling her cloak tighter. Her face was pale, but in her eyes there was a steadiness that hadn't been there the night before, a quiet resolve, born of necessity. Beyond the cave, the vast wilderness stretched away in ridges and valleys, the hunt closing in behind them, and the uncertain road ahead waiting in silence. At first light, they left the cave. The air on the ridge was sharp and thin, smelling of frost and stone. The forested slopes below still lay in shadow, but above them the peaks were touched with a pale wash of gold. The rising sun revealed a maze of gullies and rocky shelves, a harsh land, but one that could hide them if they chose their steps well. Thomas led the way along a narrow goat path that clung to the mountainside. The trail wound upward, then dipped across a jagged spine of rock where the wind moaned like a living thing. Elara kept close behind, her fingers brushing the rough stone for balance. Neither spoke. They had learned that breath was better saved for the climb. By mid-morning they had crossed into a steep ravine where the walls rose on either side like the ribs of a giant beast. At the bottom, a thin stream trickled over stones, fed by distant snowmelt. Thomas knelt to fill a hollowed horn with the icy water. Elara cupped her hands and drank, the cold biting her palms. As they rested, they heard the distant sound of iron striking against stone, faint, but carried clearly by the morning wind. Thomas froze, head tilted. He recognized the rhythm, the cautious but steady steps of men in armor, descending the trail they themselves had climbed at dawn. "They're closer than I thought," he murmured. Elara glanced at the sheer cliffs that hemmed them in. "We can't go back down the way we came. If they reach the ravine's mouth first." Thomas's gaze followed the stream upward, to where the ravine narrowed into a cleft. "There's a pass up there. Harder going, but if we keep to the water, our tracks will be harder to follow." They moved again, keeping to the stream bed. The water was icy around their boots, but it muffled their steps and washed away their trail. Now and then a loose stone clattered into the stream, but no answering shout came from behind. The climb grew steeper. The cleft narrowed until they had to edge sideways along a ledge slick with moss. Once, Elara's foot slipped and she caught herself on a jut of rock, the sharp edge biting into her palm. Thomas steadied her, his fingers briefly tightening over hers, then moved on without a word. By afternoon they reached the upper pass. The wind here was colder still, carrying with it the thin scent of distant snow. Before them the land opened into a high plateau scattered with boulders and wind-stunted pines. Beyond the plateau, the mountains rose in a wall of dark ridges. As they crossed the plateau, the sky began to lower with heavy gray clouds. Thomas glanced back and saw 3 tiny figures far down the ravine, too far to tell if they were men or shadows, but they moved steadily upward. "They'll reach the pass by nightfall," he said. Elara followed his gaze. "Then we can't rest yet." They pressed on, but the plateau offered little cover. The open ground made Thomas uneasy. He kept scanning the ridge line ahead for a break, a hollow, anything that might shelter them when darkness fell. At last, as the first flakes of snow drifted out of the clouds, they found a hollow in the lee of a large boulder. There was just enough space beneath the overhang for them to crouch out of the wind. Thomas gathered a few dry twigs from beneath the pine roots and coaxed a tiny fire to life, its flame no bigger than a candle's. Elara sat close to the flame, her cloak drawn tightly about her shoulders. Her hands still trembled faintly, but her eyes were steady. "They won't stop," she said after a long silence. "Even if we cross the mountains." Thomas looked at her across the flicker of the fire. "No. But if we reach the borderlands, the Lord's reach grows thin. We'd have a chance." Elara lowered her gaze to the flames. "A chance?" she echoed, as though tasting the word. Above them, the snow fell more thickly, softening the harsh lines of the rocks. Far down the mountain, the horn sounded again, a low, mournful call carried upward by the evening wind. Thomas reached out and gently laid a hand over Elara's. "We'll move again before dawn," he said. "The snow will cover our tracks. Tonight we rest." For a long time they sat in silence, watching the fire struggle against the cold. The night closed around them, vast and waiting, while somewhere below in the dark gullies the hunt moved steadily closer. The night settled heavy over the plateau, the snowfall deepening until the ground turned white beneath the weak flicker of the fire. The wind dropped, leaving only the soft hiss of falling snow. For a time there was a strange, fragile peace, the kind that comes not from safety, but from exhaustion. Thomas dozed in fits beside the dying flame, his head nodding forward, then jerking up at the faintest sound. Elara sat with her back against the boulder, her cloak pulled tight, staring at the tiny ember glow as if it held the last bit of warmth in the world. Every so often her eyes drifted shut, only to open again when the distant echo of a horn floated faintly up from the lower slopes. Past midnight the sky cleared. The moon rose, full and pale, casting a silvery light across the snow-covered rocks. The world grew sharper, every shadow edged in cold light. It was then that Thomas stirred, woken by the hush that often precedes movement in the wilderness. He touched Elara's arm lightly. "Wake! I hear something." She blinked, shaking off sleep, and listened. At first there was only the soft hiss of snow sliding from the pines. Then, faint but distinct, came the sound of a dog's bark, cut short as if hushed. A second bark followed, closer. Thomas doused the last ember of their fire beneath a bootful of snow. The two of them crouched in the shadow of the boulder, straining their eyes toward the dark sweep of the plateau. Through the moonlight they saw them, 3 figures moving carefully across the open snow, each carrying a short spear, one leading a leash hound that tugged at the trail. The men moved slowly, stopping often to scan the white plain. Elara's breath caught. Thomas whispered, "If they reach the rocks, we'll have nowhere to run." He motioned for her to stay low and began to edge toward a line of scattered boulders that slanted upward toward a narrow saddle between 2 ridges. Every movement had to be slow, the crusted snow crunched if pressed too quickly. Elara followed close behind, keeping her gaze fixed on the trackers. They made it halfway across the saddle before the hound lifted its head and barked sharply. The sound split the silence like a blade. The nearest tracker raised his hand, and the group changed course, heading directly toward the saddle. Thomas and Elara broke into a run, their boots kicking up loose snow. Behind them came the shout of men and the eager baying of the hound. The chase had come out of the shadows and into the open. The saddle narrowed into a crooked cleft between 2 jagged rocks. Thomas led the way through, feeling the stones scrape his shoulder. On the other side the slope dropped sharply into a shallow ravine choked with snow and fallen branches. They slid down, half falling, half scrambling, their breath coming in ragged bursts. The baying behind them grew louder. A spear clattered against the rocks above, flung in haste and gone wide. Reaching the bottom of the ravine, Thomas grabbed Elara's hand and pulled her toward the darker line of trees that fringed the lower slope. The trees would break the moonlight and give them a chance to vanish. A shout rose behind them, closer now, followed by the snap of a branch as one of the trackers slid into the ravine. The hunt was no longer distant. It was breathing down their necks. Elara stumbled once, nearly falling, but Thomas caught her and hauled her upright. Her palm, scraped raw on the climb earlier, left a faint smear of blood against his sleeve. They burst into the trees, the shadows closing around them like a door. The ground was rough here, tangled with roots and hidden stones beneath the snow. Their pace slowed, but the darkness worked in their favor. The torchlight of the pursuers bobbed and wavered far behind, struggling against the trunks and the uneven ground. At last, when their lungs burned and their legs felt carved from lead, Thomas pulled Elara into the hollow beneath a fallen tree. They crouched together, listening. The forest creaked in the cold, an owl called from somewhere higher up the slope. The baying had faded again, though it had not disappeared. Elara leaned close, her breath a faint mist in the cold air. "We can't keep this up," she whispered. "They'll run us down by dawn." Thomas turned his head toward her, his voice low and steady. "We only need to reach the next ridge. Beyond it the valleys twist and branch, even the dogs lose the trail there. One more night." For a while they stayed crouched beneath the fallen tree, either speaking, sharing the silence and the shallow warmth of each other's breath. Above the branches, the moon crept toward the edge of the ridge, and the long night edged slowly toward dawn. The first pale streaks of dawn touched the upper ridges while the forest below was still drenched in shadow. The snow had hardened overnight, carrying their weight with a faint crunch beneath each step as Thomas and Elara climbed out of the hollow beneath the fallen tree. Their limbs were stiff with cold, their breath misting in the chill air, but neither spoke. The silence between them had become a pact, to conserve breath and to keep from stirring the forest that listened as keenly as the hounds behind them. The climb was cruel. The ridge above looked close in the gray morning light, yet each time they reached what seemed the crest, another slope rose behind it. Thomas set a slow but unbroken pace, forcing his numbed legs to keep moving, pausing only to glance back. From the lower woods came now and then a faint bark, muffled by distance but never gone, a reminder that the hunt still climbed after them. By midday they reached a wind-swept shoulder of rock where the trees thinned and the land opened into a maze of gullies and narrow ravines. Here the wind cut sharply, scattering loose snow into white veils that drifted over the stone. The peaks beyond were hidden behind a low curtain of cloud, and in the distance they heard the muffled crack of shifting ice. Elara sank onto a jut of rock, her face pale beneath her hood. "I need a moment," she murmured, her breath shallow. Thomas crouched beside her, scanning the ravines below. The snow showed no dark specks of movement yet. He gave her a short nod. "One moment. Then we move. The open ground won't hide us for long." She lifted her gaze to him. The look in her eyes held no complaint, only the weary determination of one who had already gone farther than she thought she could. "I'll manage," she said softly. They moved on again, picking their way across the plateau of gullies. The snow underfoot grew deeper, sometimes collapsing into hidden hollows that sank them to the knee. More than once Thomas had to pull Elara up by the arm, feeling the tremor of exhaustion in her grip. The cold bit sharper as the clouds thickened and the afternoon waned. Toward evening they reached a place where the ravines twisted like a giant's claw marks. Narrow ledges dropped away into steep gorges where frozen streams gleamed faintly in the dim light. A crooked pine grew at the edge of one such gorge, its roots clinging to the stone as if in defiance of the wind. Thomas stopped there, crouching to study the ground. The snow near the pine was churned, the faint trace of animal tracks leading along a ledge that curved down and vanished behind an outcrop of stone. "This way," he said. "The ledge drops into one of the valley channels. If we follow it far enough, we'll come out near the lower valleys. The dogs will have trouble scenting us among the rocks." Elara followed him down the narrow path, pressing a hand to the cold wall of stone for balance. Far below the gorge's shadows lay deep and still, a dark ribbon cutting through the snowbound land. The descent was slow. The rocks were slick, the snow thin in some places and treacherously loose in others. At one point a stone shifted beneath Thomas's boot and skidded away into the gorge, vanishing soundlessly in the dark below. Both of them froze, listening, but no shout came from behind. Only the steady moan of the wind around the cliffs. Night fell early in the gorge. The sky above turned a deep indigo, streaked with thin clouds that caught the last light. The air grew colder still, and the rock walls on either side loomed like black pillars. At last, just as the moon rose over the far ridge, they reached the valley floor. Here the snow lay deep but unbroken, muffling their steps. A stand of bare willows bent over a frozen stream, their branches rattling softly in the night breeze. They crossed the stream and found a shallow hollow beneath a rocky overhang. Elara sank down at the foot of the wall, her breath coming in soft clouds. Thomas crouched beside her, listening. For a long time there was only the whisper of the willows and the faint groan of the ice beneath the snow. No horns, no dogs. "Perhaps we've shaken them," she said at last, her voice barely more than a breath. Thomas shook his head. "We've bought a little time. That's all. The valleys twist and branch. That will slow them, but it won't stop them." He pulled his cloak tighter and added quietly, "We'll rest here until the moon climbs higher. Then we'll keep moving east, toward the border valleys. There's a chance we can reach the river crossing before they do." Elara nodded, leaning back against the cold rock. Her eyes closed, though she did not sleep, and her fingers brushed the tiny pressed violet hidden in the fold of her cloak. Above them the moon climbed higher, casting long silver shadows over the frozen valley. Somewhere far behind, in the maze of ravines they had crossed, a horn called once, faint but clear in the frozen air. Thomas's gaze fixed on the dark ridge from which the sound had come. The pursuit had not been lost. It was only a matter of time before the hunters found the right path. He shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing Elara's. "We'll reach the crossing," he said under his breath, as if the words themselves might give them the strength to keep moving when the time came. For a while neither spoke again. They sat together beneath the rock ledge, listening to the frozen stream and the distant wind, holding on to the thin, uncertain promise of the road ahead. A thin veil of morning mist rose from the frozen stream as Thomas and Elara set out again, their steps muffled by fresh snow. The pale moon still lingered low in the sky, giving the valley a ghostly half-light. The path eastward followed the winding course of the stream, twisting between dark cliffs whose upper rims were lined with frost-silvered pines. Every few steps Thomas paused to listen, head tilted. All he heard was the distant rush of unseen water and the soft rasp of the wind in the willows. For a time they made good progress. The valley floor was narrow but even, the frozen stream providing a natural trail. The land slowly dropped lower, and the walls on either side drew back a little so that the pale light reached them more easily. It almost seemed, for a brief hour, that they had slipped beyond the pursuit. That illusion ended at mid-morning. Thomas halted suddenly, crouching near a curve in the bank. Elara saw it at once, a single footprint pressed into the snow by the edge of the stream, the heel deep, the toe smudged by a slide forward. Not theirs. Fresh. Perhaps only an hour old. Her breath caught, and she looked to Thomas. He straightened slowly, scanning the bend ahead. "A scout," he said in a low voice. "They've split their party." They moved on more cautiously now, keeping to the far edge of the stream, treading where the ice had been scuffed by falling branches to blur their trail. The gorge narrowed again, forcing them beneath an overhang of dark rock. Above them the cliffs leaned close, and the light thinned until it seemed almost like evening though the day was barely begun. Near noon the stream spilled into a small basin, an oval hollow rimmed by boulders and low stone ledges. At its far side a channel opened eastward, leading down toward the lower valleys and, beyond them, the river crossing they sought. But on the snow in the center of the basin lay a scatter of footprints, many boots, heavy-soled, stamping down the surface in a broad path. A bit of tattered cloth clung to a thornbush, blue with a torn edge, the color of the castle's hunting livery. Elara's lips parted but no sound came out. Thomas touched her arm briefly and drew her back into the shadows beneath the overhang. From there they watched the basin in silence. Presently a small group appeared at the eastern channel, 3 men, cloaked against the cold, 2 bearing spears. They crossed the basin without haste, scanning the ground now and then, then followed the stream bed westward, toward the way Thomas and Alara had come. Only when the men were gone and the hollow lay still again did Thomas exhale. "A forward band," he murmured. "The rest can't be far." They waited another hour in the shadows until the light began to shift and the snow in the basin lost its morning sheen. Then Thomas led the way in a wide curve around the far rim of the hollow, keeping to the shelter of the rocks. Their steps were slow and careful, the silence between them taut as a drawn bowstring. By late afternoon they had passed into the eastern channel and begun the slow descent through the narrowing valley. The cliffs here were lower, more broken, scattered with stunted pines and crags that cast long slanting shadows as the light waned. The air smelled faintly of damp earth beneath the snow, a sign that they were nearing the lower country. But as they came round a bend where the channel widened into a little flat, Thomas stopped short. Across the open ground, not 50 paces ahead, a column of smoke rose in the still air, thin and pale but unmistakable. Someone had kindled a small fire there recently. Alara's hand went to her mouth. Thomas motioned her back behind a jut of stone. They crouched together in the cold shadow, scarcely breathing. A moment later they saw them, 2 riders leading a third horse down into the flat, their cloaks dark with frost. One dismounted to stir the fire while the other led the horses toward the stream for water. The third horse bore a pack slung across its saddle, light enough for a scout's party. Thomas leaned closer to Alara and whispered, "We'll have to wait for nightfall. They'll stay here till the main party arrives." Alara's eyes moved from the smoke to the riders, then to the forested ridge that loomed beyond. "If we tried to slip past them in the dark..." He shook his head. "Too close. We'll have to circle. The ridge above looks broken. Maybe there's a path." So as dusk thickened, they drew back silently, retracing their steps until the bend hid the fire's faint glow. Then, keeping low, they began to climb the broken slope on the northern side of the channel. Loose stones shifted beneath their boots, and once Alara grasped Thomas's hand to steady herself as they edged between 2 leaning slabs of rock. Higher up, the snow thinned, and the wind off the ridge stung their faces. At the crest they paused. Below and behind them the faint red spark of the scout's fire flickered in the gathering dark. Ahead the slope fell away toward a wider valley, dimly visible in the moonrise, the valley that led, Thomas hoped, to the river. "We'll keep along the ridge till the moon's high," he said softly. "If we're lucky, we can reach the lower country before dawn." Alara only nodded, her eyes fixed on the distant silver line of the river that glimmered faintly between the hills. They turned eastward again, 2 small figures against the vast dark sweep of the ridge, moving on through the night while somewhere below them the hunters gathered in the valley. The moon had climbed high, riding pale and thin above the dark ridges. Its light washed the rocks in silver and turned the snow to a faint, glittering dust. The ridge path was narrow and uneven, no more than a series of ledges strung along the steep face of the mountain. Far below, the valley lay hidden beneath slow-drifting mist, and in that mist, Thomas thought he saw the faint glow of a second fire, larger than the scouts' camp. The main party was not far behind. He pushed forward without a word, feeling the brittle crunch of frozen lichen under his boots. The wind bit sharper here, sweeping unhindered across the high ridge. It plucked at Alara's cloak, threatening to drag her off balance, and more than once Thomas reached back to steady her by the wrist as they edged along narrow ledges no wider than a sheep's trail. For a time the path climbed steadily upward, clinging to the side of the ridge beneath a wall of jagged crags. The moonlight showed no trees now, only rock and snow and the dark emptiness of the gulf below. The silence was so deep that the rasp of their own breathing seemed loud against the mountain's cold stillness. Then, without warning, the ledge they followed came to an abrupt end where a slab of rock had sheared away long ago, leaving a gap no wider than a man's stride but with a sheer drop yawning beneath. A thin crust of snow had drifted across the gap, hiding the black hollow below. Thomas crouched, testing the edges with his gloved hand. The stone beneath the snow was slick with ice. Alara stood very still, her eyes fixed on the gap. "It's too wide," she said in a low voice. The wind tugged a loose strand of her hair across her cheek. Thomas studied the opposite side. It's not far. I'll go first. When I'm across, I'll give you my hand. He shifted his pack, took 2 careful steps back on the narrow ledge, and sprang forward. His boots struck the far edge with a dull thud, and for a heartbeat he wavered before finding his balance. Then he crouched, leaning out over the void, and stretched his arm across the gap. "No," he said. "Quickly." Elara drew in a sharp breath, gathered the skirts of her cloak to keep them from tangling, and stepped to the brink. For an instant she froze, staring down at the void beneath the snow crust. Then she leapt. Her boots struck the stone beside his, her knee slipped on the slick ice, but his grip closed around her wrist and hauled her up to safety. For a moment they stood together, pressed close against the rock face, the cold wind searing their faces. Then Thomas guided her forward again, and they moved on. The ridge curved eastward, descending gradually toward the lower country. Here the rocks were broken by narrow gullies and outcrops of pine that bent under the weight of snow. Through the gaps in the ridge they glimpsed, far below, a dark plain streaked with silver, the frozen river glimmering under the moonlight. Beyond it lay the borderlands, a darker line of forest at the edge of the horizon. They had gone scarcely another mile when Thomas halted suddenly, raising a hand for silence. Elara followed his gaze upward. Against the starlit sky a dark shape wheeled silently, then another. 2 birds, large and slow-winged, circling above the ridge. "Carrion crows," Thomas said under his breath. "Following the scouts' fires. Or—" His eyes shifted eastward, scanning the slope below. "They follow the hunt." They moved more swiftly now, keeping to the shadowed side of the rocks where the moonlight did not touch them. Several times Thomas paused to listen, but the wind off the ridge carried no sound of pursuit. Only when they rounded another shoulder of rock and began to descend a long scree slope did they hear it, a distant horn, faint but clear, rising up through the night air from the valley they had left behind. Elara glanced back over her shoulder. The sound was far, yet it carried the promise of relentless pursuit. "They've found the scouts' trail," she whispered. Thomas's jaw tightened. "We have a lead, but it won't last. We must reach the river before dawn." The descent grew steeper as they neared the lower slopes. Snow gave way to loose shale and frost-hardened earth. The wind dropped as they left the ridge's crest and entered a sheltered hollow where a line of pines grew close together, their trunks black against the pale snow. Here the scent of resin and damp earth replaced the thin, icy air of the heights. They paused briefly under the shelter of the trees. Thomas scanned the slope below, tracing the faint silver gleam of a stream that ran down toward the plain. "That stream will lead us to the river," he said. "If we keep to it, we'll reach the crossing before noon." Elara nodded but swayed slightly as she stood. He steadied her with a hand at her elbow. Her face was pale, her lips pressed together against the bite of the wind. "We'll rest once we reach the river," he said, and for the first time that night his voice softened. They moved again, keeping to the shadowed line of the pines. Far below them the plain lay silent under the moon, the river glimmering like a blade laid across the land. Beyond it, unseen but near, lay the border and the promise of a different life, if they could reach it before the hunters closed in. The first blush of dawn crept across the eastern sky as Thomas and Elara descended from the last pine-covered slope. The ridge behind them was a black sawtooth against the paling heavens, and the moon, pale and worn, still hung over its edge. Before them stretched the frozen plain, a wide, white expanse under a faint morning mist, and cutting across it like a ribbon of tarnished silver lay the river, their goal. The air was bitter in the open land. The snow here was wind-hardened, crusted in ripples that crunched softly beneath their boots. To the west, the land rose again into foothills, but to the east, the plain lay open and empty. Every sound carried, the creak of the leather straps on their packs, the soft hiss of their breath, even the distant croak of a lone crow wheeling high above the plain. For a little while they walked in silence, following the winding course of the shallow stream that had led them down from the ridge. Its frozen bed glittered faintly in the cold light, a silent guide across the featureless plain. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the distant dark line of trees that marked the riverbank. From time to time he glanced back at the ridge behind them. At first there was nothing but the thin gray haze of dawn over the slopes. Then, as the sun's rim touched the farthest peaks, he saw a glint, no more than a flicker, among the rocks near the valley mouth. A glint that came again a moment later, moving. He slowed his pace, his gaze fixed on that distant point. Elara noticed the change and looked back. "Do you see them?" she whispered. Thomas nodded once. "Riders. Still far off, but on the move." The open plain offered no place to hide. Their only hope lay in the lead they still held and the chance that the hunters would be slowed in crossing the ridge they had left behind. Thomas quickened his stride without another word. Elara matched his pace, though he could hear her breath growing uneven in the thin, cold air. By mid-morning the sun had climbed above the ridge, but its light brought no warmth. The plain shimmered faintly under the pale sky, and the river at last came clear to their sight, wide and still, its surface locked in ice except where the current showed dark water in the mid-channel. On the far bank rose a fringe of leafless willows and, beyond them, the first low hills of the borderlands. Elara's eyes fixed on that distant bank. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She tightened the fold of her cloak against the cold, and kept walking. When they were still half a mile from the river, Thomas slowed again. The ice along the nearer bank was rough and broken, jagged where floes had shifted in the early winter freeze. A single dark line marked the midcurrent, too wide to leap, too swift and black to risk lightly. He knew this crossing. In spring and summer there was a ford here where carts passed between the valleys and the outer lands, but in deep winter the river's ice was treacherous, strong in some places, thin in others where the current gnawed from below. They reached the river's edge just as the sun climbed higher and the mist over the plain began to thin. The wind had dropped, and in the sudden stillness the faint creak and crack of the river ice carried clearly. Elara looked across the expanse of white and silver to the far bank, then back at Thomas. "Can we cross it?" He studied the ice in silence for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If we keep to the edges where the current is slow, we can. But we'll need to move quickly. If they reach the bank while we're still on the ice." He did not finish the thought. They stepped out onto the frozen river. The ice near the shore was thick and dull white, laced with pale cracks like the veins of marble. It groaned faintly beneath their weight, but held firm. They moved carefully, keeping to the shallower edge, testing each step before trusting their full weight. Their breath smoked in the cold air, and the faint sound of the ice beneath them seemed to echo over the still water. Halfway across, they reached a place where the ice dipped lower, its surface swept clean by the wind. A narrow lane of dark water opened only a few paces away, gliding past with slow, heavy movement. The ice beneath their boots creaked more sharply here. Thomas gestured for Elara to step where he did, guiding her in a slow arc toward a rougher, paler section that promised firmer footing. They had almost reached the far bank when the sound came, distant at first, then rising clearer on the cold air, the faint ringing of iron on ice, the muffled crack of hooves on frozen ground. Elara turned her head sharply, and Thomas followed her gaze. Far back on the edge of the plain, tiny against the white land and dark ridge behind them, a line of riders had emerged from the valley mouth. Even at this distance the sunlight struck their spears with a pale flash. "They've found our trail," Thomas said quietly. He took Elara's arm and urged her forward. "Hurry!" The ice beneath them groaned again but held. A dozen more careful steps brought them to the rough rim where frozen earth rose from the shallows to meet the far bank. Thomas pulled Elara up the last short slope and turned once more to look back across the river. The riders were still far, but they were moving steadily, their horses breaking into a canter over the hardened snow. The river's breadth and the uncertainty of the ice would slow them, but not for long. Elara followed his gaze, her breath coming in quick white bursts. "We made it across," she said, her voice hushed, as though afraid to rouse the river itself. Thomas gave a short nod, his eyes still on the distant line of riders. "We've bought time, not safety." Beyond the willows that lined the bank a faint path wound upward into the first hills of the borderlands. Thomas set his hand briefly on Elara's shoulder, then turned toward that path. "Come," he said. "We keep moving until we find the old watchtower." It's abandoned, but it'll give us a place to rest before nightfall. They left the river behind, its frozen surface stretching silent and pale in the growing light. While behind them across the plain the hunt pressed on, its dark line advancing steadily over the snow. The land beyond the river was rougher than it had looked from the far bank. Low hills rose in long, rolling waves, their slopes dotted with clusters of bare oaks and scattered boulders crusted with frost. Between the hills ran narrow, winding gullies filled with snow and the dark, bristling spears of winter grass. The air here smelled different, drier, with the faint scent of pine drifting down from the higher ridges farther east. Thomas and Elara followed a faint path that climbed between two hills toward the higher ground. The snow underfoot was softer than the river's ice, muffling their steps. Now and then they passed the black stumps of old posts, or a tumble of broken stones half buried under the drift, the last traces of the old border fortifications long since fallen to ruin. By mid-morning the sun had climbed higher, though its pale warmth barely touched the frozen land. Thomas halted on a rocky rise to skim the plain behind them. The river glinted like a silver scar across the white ground. Beyond it, at the far edge of the plain, a faint thread of dark movement marked the riders, too distant to count clearly, but unmistakable. They had reached the river bank. "They'll be forced to slow at the crossing," Thomas said, more to himself than to Elara. "But once they're across, the hills won't hold them back for long." Elara turned her gaze eastward, toward the higher ridges where a darker line of forest climbed the slopes. "How far is the watchtower?" "Before nightfall we can reach it, if we keep the pace." He looked down at her boots, rimed with frost. "Can you manage it?" She gave a brief, firm nod. Her face was pale and drawn, but there was a quiet steadiness in her eyes. "As long as we keep moving." They pressed on. The path wound upward into steeper country where the wind hissed through the withered grass and whistled among scattered rocks. Once, as they rounded the shoulder of a hill, Thomas halted abruptly and motioned Elara down. Together they crouched behind a fallen tree and watched as 3 deer moved slowly across the hollow below, a stag and 2 does, their coats thick and gray for winter. The animals paused now and then to sniff the air, then bounded lightly up the opposite slope and vanished among the hills. The sight gave Thomas a moment's cautious hope. Where deer could pass, the land still offered a way forward, and the riders, burdened with horses and armor, would have to keep to the broader gullies, losing time in the rougher country. Toward afternoon the land grew rockier. The oaks thinned and the wind strengthened, carrying with it a sharper edge of cold. They climbed a long, slanting ridge where the snow lay in drifted banks among the stones, and from the crest they saw, at last, the faint outline of the watchtower, a broken finger of gray stone jutting above a lower ridge, silhouetted against the pale winter sky. Elara's eyes fixed on it, and for a moment her shoulders seemed to ease. "It's closer than I thought," she said softly. Thomas followed her gaze but did not relax. "Closer, yes. But not close enough to be safe yet." The last part of the day's journey was the hardest. The path vanished among the hills, forcing them to pick their way over rough ground. Twice they had to cross narrow ravines where the snow was deep and the stones beneath were slick with hidden ice. The wind keened along the ridges, scouring their faces raw. At last, as the sun dipped toward the west and the sky began to glow faintly gold at the edges, they climbed the final slope to the ridge below the tower. Up close, the ruin was little more than a jagged stump of ancient stone, its upper half long since fallen, leaving a hollow shell open to the sky. A scatter of tumbled blocks lay around its base, half buried in snow, and a few thorn bushes clung to the crumbled wall, rattling dryly in the wind. Thomas led the way inside the ruin through a gap where the wall had collapsed. The interior was bare save for a few scattered stones and a patch of old timber that might once have been a stair. The floor was sheltered from the wind, and there was enough dry brush in the lee of the wall to build a small fire. When the fire at last caught and sent up a thin thread of smoke that was lost in the open air above, Elara crouched beside it, warming her hands. The light cast her face in soft gold, throwing long shadows across the broken stones. Thomas stood for a time in the gap of the wall, gazing back westward. The river was no longer visible from here, hidden behind the folds of the hills, but the line of their pursuers had surely crossed it by now. Somewhere out there, among the snowy hollows of the plain, the hunt was still coming. After a while he turned back to the fire. "We'll stay here until dawn. The tower gives us shelter, and from the ridge we can watch the western approaches. If they reach the hills by morning, we'll see them before they see us." Elara looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the small, wavering flame. "And after tomorrow?" Thomas's gaze shifted eastward, beyond the dark ridges and the bare winter trees. "Beyond these hills lies the lowland forest. If we can reach it, the land will hide us better than these open slopes. The hunt will lose some of its strength there." He said no more, and for a long while they sat in silence, the only sounds the faint hiss of the fire and the soft whisper of the wind through the broken stones. Outside, the sky deepened to indigo, and the first pale stars pricked the cold air. Somewhere far below in the hidden valleys, a wolf howled once, long and low, and the sound rolled like a distant bell through the hills. Elara drew her cloak more closely around her shoulders. "I never thought freedom would sound so much like the cry of a wolf," she said, half to herself. Thomas glanced at her, then back toward the darkening land. "Freedom often keeps the same company as hunger and the cold," he said quietly. "But it's still worth the road." The fire burned low as night deepened over the ruin of the tower. Outside, the wind whispered over the stones, and in the valleys behind them the hunt drew nearer, unseen but unceasing. The night in the broken tower was sharp and bitter. The fire dwindled to embers that glowed like a sleeping heart beneath the ashes. A slice of moon climbed over the ridges, casting a cold silver light across the ruined stones and the stark, empty hills. The shadows lengthened and shifted as the wind stirred the bare thorn bushes clinging to the wall. Thomas sat near the breach in the wall, his back against a half-fallen block of stone, the hilt of his knife within easy reach. His eyes moved constantly between the moonlit ridges and the dark valleys below. The land lay still, but that stillness was too perfect, the kind that listens, as if holding its breath. Elara dozed at last, her head bowed, her face turned toward the embers. The weariness of days on the run had at last dragged her down. Even in sleep her brow was faintly furrowed, as though she dreamed of the narrow streets of the village or the distant warmth of the bakery she had once known. A faint sound drifted up the slope, so slight that Thomas at first thought it the rustle of dry thorns. Then it came again, the soft crack of snow crust breaking under a weighty tread. He slid silently to his feet, laid a hand on Elara's shoulder, and pressed a finger to his lips when her eyes fluttered open. For a long while they listened, scarcely breathing. The wind hissed softly over the ridge, tugging at their cloaks. Far below, in the hollow between the hills, a faint spark glimmered and went out. A campfire, quickly smothered. Someone else was out there in the night. Thomas crouched at the edge of the breach, staring down the slope. The spark had been too far to belong to hunters on foot. Likely a scout from the riders, slipping ahead of the main party. If so, the rest of the pursuers were not far behind. At last he drew back and murmured to Elara, keeping his voice as low as the sighing wind. "They've crossed the river. They're in the hills tonight. We move before dawn, or we're trapped between the ridges." Elara nodded, her face pale in the moonlight but her voice steady. "Then we move." They waited out the long hours until the first faint whitening of the eastern sky. Before the rim of the sun could show itself, Thomas kicked snow over the embers and scattered them to hide the trace. They slipped silently from the ruin and began to climb along the spine of the ridge. As the morning light grew, the world came slowly into focus, the long folds of the hills running like frozen waves, the black lines of bare trees in the gullies, the pale breath of frost over every shadowed hollow. Behind them the ridge with the tower fell away into mist. Ahead, the higher ridges rose sharp and blue in the morning haze. Their path wound upward, skirting narrow defile where the snow lay deep. Sometimes the ice beneath broke with a hollow crack, making Elara flinch and clutch Thomas's sleeve. They moved quickly but without haste, conserving their strength. By mid-morning they reached a saddle between two peaks. From there the land sloped down toward a broader valley. Far beyond that valley, The dark belt of the lowland forest stretched like a distant promise across the horizon. Alara's breath caught at the sight of it. "If we can reach the trees—" Thomas shaded his eyes and searched the valley below. No sign of riders yet, only the drifting curls of morning mist. Still, he did not allow himself to relax. "The forest is freedom," he said. "But valleys are traps. We cross before nightfall, or we may never reach the far side." They began the long descent. The valley floor was treacherous. Patches of thin ice over half-frozen streams, hidden pits where the snow had drifted deep. Once Thomas had to catch Alara as her foot broke through the crust, and she stumbled into icy water up to the knee. They pressed on, wet and cold, teeth clenched against the biting wind. The sun dipped lower as they neared the far side of the valley. The forest still lay several miles away, the dark trees lifting like a wall against the pale sky. Behind them, faint but growing clearer with every gust of wind, came the distant echo of horses moving at a trot. Alara heard it too and glanced back, her eyes wide but bright with resolve. "They've found our trail. Then we keep going." Thomas's voice was quiet, but there was an iron edge in it. They began the final climb toward the low pass that led to the forested lands beyond. The light faded into the blue of dusk, and the wind brought the distant baying of hounds. The sound drifted over the valley like a thread of smoke, thin but unmistakable. Alara's breath came in sharp white clouds. "They're closer than we thought." Thomas spared a brief glance back. "Closer, yes. But the forest is closer still." They pushed on into the rising dark, the snow crunching softly beneath their feet, the baying of the hounds weaving itself into the long echoes of the valley. The last leg to the forest felt like walking on the edge of a blade. The snow had crusted hard in the evening chill, crunching loudly beneath their boots. Every sound, the snap of a twig underfoot, the distant call of a night bird, seemed to echo across the empty slopes. Behind them, the baying of the hounds grew louder, carrying with it the iron clatter of hooves. The moon rose pale and cold over the ridge as they reached the crest of the last hill. Below, the land tilted down into a shallow basin filled with a thin mist. Beyond that, dark and still as if carved from night itself, loomed the forest. The trees crowded close together, their branches locked, their shadows thick. From where they stood, the forest seemed like a living wall, silent and waiting. Thomas paused, scanning the valley behind them. A faint glimmer of torches flickered far off in the lowlands, moving slowly but steadily in their direction. The riders had spread out, their pursuit methodical. The hounds would soon catch the fresh scent in the snow. He looked at Alara. Her cheeks were pale with cold, a strand of dark hair plastered to her temple with frost. Yet her eyes were fixed on the dark edge of the forest with an expression that was not fear but something fiercer, a longing so sharp it almost looked like defiance. "We reach the trees and we vanish," Thomas said quietly. "In the woods, the horses will be slowed. The hounds will falter. We'll have the land on our side." They began the descent into the basin. The ground here was treacherous. Drifts of snow covered hollows where icy water ran beneath. Twice Thomas had to pull Alara clear of places where her foot broke through. The moonlight painted everything silver, turning the mist into a pale sea in which their dark figures moved like shadows. Halfway across the basin they heard it, a horn, deep and mournful, blown from somewhere on the ridge behind them. The hound's baying rose in answer, wild and eager. The hunt was closing in. Thomas's hand closed briefly over Alara's wrist. "We run," he said. They stumbled forward together, slipping on the frozen ground but regaining their balance each time. Their breath came in ragged bursts, white against the dark. The edge of the forest grew larger with every desperate stride, the black trunks rising like pillars, the branches above knitting together into a tangled roof that promised concealment. The first trees loomed around them, their bark rough and cold under Thomas's gloved hand as he pulled Alara between them. The ground beneath the trees was firmer, the snow shallower where the branches had caught it. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sounds of pursuit became muffled, swallowed by the thick woods. They did not stop. They plunged deeper between the trunks, following a faint animal path that wound through thickets of brush. The moonlight barely reached here, The darkness was almost complete save for scattered patches of pale glow where the branches thinned. At last, when their breath burned in their throats, and their legs trembled with exhaustion, Thomas halted in a small clearing. A fallen pine lay across the ground, and beside it the earth dipped into a shallow hollow. He guided Alara down and knelt beside her, listening. The hounds still bayed, but the sound was fainter now, confused, as if the dogs had lost the direct trail. The wind rustled the treetops above, carrying with it the dry creak of branches rubbing together. Alara's head sank into her hands for a moment, her shoulders heaving. "I thought they would catch us before we reached the trees." "They nearly did." Thomas's voice was low, but there was a grim thread of satisfaction in it. "But the forest doesn't welcome riders. It has its own ways." He crouched, scanning the ground for tracks and the lay of the brush. "We'll follow the stream northward at first light. It winds deep into the woods. There's a hermit's chapel a day's journey from here, abandoned long ago, but it will give us shelter." Alara looked up at him. Her face was still pale, but the tightness around her mouth had eased a little. "Do you think we've truly escaped?" Thomas did not answer at once. His eyes roamed the shadows between the trees. At last he said, "We've bought ourselves a night. Perhaps more. Freedom is taken one night at a time." A silence fell between them. Above, a gust of wind stirred the tall pines, and their long, whispering sigh moved through the darkness like the breath of something ancient and unseen. Alara leaned back against the fallen tree and closed her eyes. For the first time in days her lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. "Even one night," she murmured, "feels like a kind of victory." Thomas said nothing. He remained crouched, watching the forest edge as the moon slid westward through the tangled branches, and the baying of the hounds faded into the far-off valleys beyond the ridge. In the stillness of that winter night, with the cold earth beneath them and the sheltering woods around them, the fugitive baker and the castle maid rested side by side, the long flight behind them for now, the uncertain road ahead waiting for the dawn.